Section 1 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, translated by David Lewis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ed Humpal. The Obscure Night of the Soul. Argument. I begin this book with the stanzas that I have undertaken to explain. I shall then explain them line by line. The first and second stanzas describe the effects of the spiritual purgations of our sensitive and spiritual nature. The rest, 6 in number, describe the various and wonderful effects of spiritual illumination and union with God in love. Stanzas. In an obscure night, with anxious love inflamed, O happy lot! Forth unobserved I went, my house being now at rest. In darkness and obscurity, by the secret ladder disguised, O happy lot! In darkness and concealment, my house being now at rest. In that happy night, in secret, seen of none, and seeing naught myself, without other light or guide save that in which my heart was burning. That light guided me, more surely than the noonday sun, to the place where he was waiting for me, whom I knew well, and where none but he appeared. O guiding night! O night more lovely than the dawn! O night that hast united the lover with his beloved, and changed her into her love. On my flowery bosom, kept whole for him alone, he reposed and slept. I cherished him, and the waving of the cedars fanned him. Then his hair floated in the breeze that blew from the turret. He struck me on the neck with his gentle hand, and all sensation left me. I continued in oblivion lost. My head was resting on my love. I fainted away, abandoned, and, amid the lilies forgotten, threw all my cares away. Object of the preceding stanzas. Before entering on the explanation of these stanzas, I must premise that they are the song of the soul in the state of perfection, in union with God by love, after passing through those deep tribulations and distresses in the spiritual exercise of the straight way of eternal life. This is the way, as our Saviour saith in the Gospel, by which the soul must ordinarily travel to the high and divine union with God. How narrow is the gate, and strait is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. This road being so straight, and they who find it being so few, the soul exults in having traversed it to the perfection of love. This is the substance of the first stanza. The straight way is with great propriety called the obscure night, as it appears from the following stanzas. The soul, then, having travelled on this straight road, where so many blessings have come upon it, thus rejoiceth. End of Section 1. Section 2 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1 of the Night of Sense. In an obscure night, with anxious love inflamed, O happy lot! Forth unobserved I went, my house being now at rest. Explanation. Here the soul describes the way and manner of its departure, as to all selfish and other affections, dying thereto and to itself by real mortification, so that it may come to the sweet and pleasing life of love in God. It went forth from itself and from all things in an obscure night, by which is meant purgative contemplation, as I shall hereafter explain, which leads the soul to deny itself and all besides. This departure of the soul was affected in the strength and fervor of love with which the bridegroom inspired it in the obscure contemplation for that end. The soul magnifies its own happiness in having journeyed Godwards in that night so successfully as to escape all hindrance on the part of its three enemies, the world, the devil, and the flesh, which are always found infesting this road. For the night of purgative contemplation had lulled to sleep and mortified, in the house of sensuality, all passions and desires in their rebellious motions. Chapter 1. Of the Imperfections of Beginners. In an obscure night. Souls enter this obscure night when God is drawing them out of the state of beginners, which is that of those who meditate in the spiritual way, and is leading them into that of proficients, the state of contemplatives, that, having passed through it, they may arrive at the state of the perfect, which is that of the divine union with God. That we may the better understand the nature of this night through which the soul has to pass, and why God leads men into it, it is necessary to touch upon certain characteristics of beginners, that they may perceive the weakness of their state, take courage, and desire to be led of God into this night, where the soul is established in virtue and prepared for the inestimable delights of His love. Though I shall dwell at some length upon this point, I shall do so no longer than suffices for the immediate discussion of the obscure night. We are to keep in mind that a soul, when seriously converted to the service of God, is, in general, spiritually nursed and caressed as an infant by its loving mother, who warms it in her bosom, nourishes it with her own sweet milk, feeds it with tender and delicate food, carries it in her arms, and fondles it. But as the child grows up, the mother withholds her caresses, hides her breasts, and anoints them with the juice of bitter aloes. She carries the infant in her arms no longer, but makes it walk on the ground, so that, losing the habits of an infant, it may apply itself to greater and more substantial pursuits. The grace of God, like a loving mother, as soon as the soul is regenerated in the new fire and fervor of His service, treats it in the same way. For it is then furnished without labor on its own part with spiritual milk, sweet and delicious in the things of God, and in devotional exercises with great delight, God giving it to the breasts of His own tender love, as a mother to her babe. Such souls, therefore, delight to spend many hours, and perhaps whole nights, in prayer. Their pleasures are penances, their joy is fasting, and their consolations are the use of the sacraments and the frequentation of divine offices. Now, spiritual men generally, speaking spiritually, are extremely weak and imperfect here, though they apply themselves to devotion and practice it with great resolution, earnestness, and care. For being drawn to these things and to their spiritual exercises by the comfort and satisfaction they find therein, and not being confirmed in virtue by the struggle it demands, they fall into many errors and imperfections in their spiritual life. For every man's work corresponds to the habit of perfection which he has acquired. These souls, therefore, not having had time to acquire those habits of vigor, must, of necessity, perform their acts, like children, weakly. To make this more evident, and to show how weak are beginners in virtue, in those good works which they perform with so much ease and pleasure, I proceed to explain with reference to the 7 capital sins, pointing out some of the imperfections into which beginners fall in the matter of each of them. This will show us plainly how like children they are, and how great are the blessings of this obscure night of which I am about to speak, seeing that it cleanses and purifies the soul from all these imperfections. End of Section 2. Section 3 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 2, of some imperfections to which beginners are liable in the matter of pride. When beginners become aware of their own fervor and diligence in their spiritual works and devotional exercises, this prosperity of theirs gives rise to secret pride, though holy things tend of their own nature to humility, because of their imperfections. And the issue is that they conceive a certain satisfaction in the contemplation of their works and of themselves. From the same source, too, proceeds that empty eagerness which they display in speaking before others of the spiritual life, and sometimes to teach it instead of learning it. They condemn others in their minds when they see that they are not devout in their own way. Sometimes also they give expression in words to that feeling, showing themselves herein to be like the Pharisee, who in the act of prayer boasted of his own good works and despised the publican. This fervor and the desire to do such and other like acts is frequently fed by Satan, in order that men of this kind may grow in pride and presumption. He knows perfectly well that all the virtuous works of people in this state are not only nothing worth, but rather tending to sin. Some of them go so far as to think none good but themselves, and so both in word and act fall into condemnation and detraction of others. They see the mote in the eye of their brother, but not the beam which is in their own. They strain out the gnat in another man's cup, and swallow the camel in their own. Sometimes also, when their spiritual masters, such as confessors and superiors, do not approve of their spirit and conduct, for they wish to be praised and considered for what they do, they decide that they are not understood, and that their superiors are not spiritual men, because they do not approve and sanction their proceedings. So they go about in quest of someone else who will accommodate himself to their fancy, for in general they love to discuss their spirit with those who, they think, will commend and extol their state. They avoid, as they would death, those who depreciate their feelings with the view of leading them into a safe way, and sometimes they even hate them. Presuming greatly on themselves, they make many resolutions and accomplish little. They are occasionally desirous that others should perceive their spirituality and devotion, and for that end they make many exterior movements, give vent to sighs, and practice divers ceremonies. And sometimes, too, they fall into a kind of rapture in public rather than in private, whereunto Satan contributes, and they are pleased when others witness it. Many of them seek to be the favorites of their confessors, and the result is endless envy and disquietude. They are ashamed to confess their sins plainly, lest their confessors should think less of them, so they go about palliating them, that they may not seem so bad, which is excusing rather than accusing themselves. Sometimes they go to a stranger to confess their sin, that their usual confessor may not suppose they are sinners but good people. And so they always take pleasure in telling him of their goodness, and that in terms suggestive of more than is in them. At the least, they wish all their goodness to be appreciated, when it would be greater humility on their part, as I shall presently show, to undervalue what is their own, and to be anxious that neither their confessor nor anyone else should think them of the least importance. Some beginners, too, make very light of their faults occasionally, and at other times indulge in immoderate grief when they commit them. They thought themselves already saints, and so they became angry and impatient with themselves, which is another great imperfection. They also importune God to deliver them from their faults and imperfections, but it is for the comfort of living in peace, and not for God. They do not consider that, were He to deliver them, they would become, perhaps, prouder than ever. They are great enemies of other men's praise, but great lovers of their own, and sometimes they seek it. In this respect they resemble the foolish virgins who, with untrimmed lamps, went about in search of oil, saying, "Give us your oil, for our lamps are gone out." Some, too, fall deeply into these imperfections, and into great evils by reason of them. Some, however, fall into them less than others, and some have to contend with little more than the first motions of them. But scarcely anyone can be found who, in his first fervours, did not fall into some of them. But those who at this time are going on to perfection proceed in a very different way, and in a very different temper of mind. They grow and edify themselves in humility, not only looking on their own works as nothing, but also dissatisfied with themselves. They look upon all others as much better than themselves. They regard them with a holy envy in their anxiety to serve God as well as they do. For the greater their fervour, the more numerous their good works, and the keener the pleasure therein. The more they perceive, for they humble themselves, how much is that which God deserves at their hands, and how little is all they can do for him. Thus the more they do, the less they are satisfied. So great is what they in their love would fain do, that all they are doing seems nothing. This loving anxiety so importunes and occupies them that they never consider whether others are doing good or not, and if they themselves should ever do good, it is in the conviction that all others are much better than themselves. They also think slightingly of themselves, and wish others to do so also, to make no account of them, and to despise what belongs to them, and moreover, if anyone should praise and respect them, they will give them no credit, for they think it strange that anybody should speak well of them. Persons of this kind, in great tranquillity and humility, are very desirous to learn the things that are profitable to them from anyone, be he who he may. In this respect, the very opposite of those of whom I have just spoken, who are willing to teach everybody, and who, when anyone seems about to teach them anything, take the words out of his mouth as if they knew it already. But these of whom I am now speaking are very far from wishing to instruct anyone. They are most ready to travel by another road if they be but commanded, for they never imagine that they can be right in anything. When others are praised, they rejoice, and their only regret is that they do not serve God themselves as well as they. They are not anxious to speak about their own state, because they think so lightly of it that they are, as it were, ashamed to speak of it to their confessors, for it seems to them unworthy of any mention whatever. But they have a great desire to speak of their shortcomings and sins, or of what they consider not to be virtues. Thus they incline to treat of the affairs of their soul with those who have no great opinion of their state in spirit. This is a characteristic of that spirituality which is pure, simple, true, and most pleasing unto God. For as the Spirit of the divine wisdom dwells in these humble souls, he moves and inclines them to keep his treasures secretly within, and to cast out the evil. God gives this grace together with other virtues to the humble, and withholds it from the proud. Persons of this kind will give their heart's blood for him who serves God, and will aid him to the utmost of their powers. When they commit any imperfection, they will bear up under it with humility, in gentleness of spirit, in loving fear of God, and hoping in him. But the souls who in the beginning travel thus towards perfection are few, yea, very few, and we ought to be content when they do not rush into the opposite evils. This is the reason, as I shall hereafter explain, why God leads into the obscure night those souls whom he will purify from all these imperfections, in order to their further advancement. End of Section 3. Section 4 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 3, of the Imperfections of Avarice, in the spiritual sense. Many a beginner also falls at times into great spiritual avarice. Scarcely anyone is contented with that measure of the Spirit which God gives. They are disconsolate and querulous because they do not find the comfort they expected in spiritual things. Many are never satisfied with listening to spiritual counsels and precepts, with reading books which treat of their state, and they spend more time in this than in doing their duty, having no regard to that mortification and perfection of interior spiritual poverty, to which they ought to apply themselves. Besides, they load themselves with images, rosaries, and crucifixes, curious and costly, now taking up one, then another, now changing them, and then resuming them again. At one time they will have them of a certain fashion, at another time of another, prizing one more than another because curious or costly. Some may be seen with an Agnus Dei, and with relics and medals, like children with coral. I condemn here that attachment and clinging of the heart to the form, number, and curiosity of these things, because in direct opposition to poverty of spirit, which looks only to the substance of devotion, which makes use indeed of these things, but only sufficiently for the end, and disdains that variety and curiosity in them. For real devotion must spring out of the heart, and consider only the truth and substance which the objects in question represent. All beyond this is attachment and imperfection, and the soul, if it is to go on unto perfection, must root out that feeling utterly. I knew a person who for more than 10 years used continually, without interruption, a cross rudely formed of a piece of blessed palm, and fastened together by a common pin bent backwards until I took it away. This was a person not deficient in sense and intellect. I knew another who had a rosary made of the backbones of fish, and whose devotion, I am certain, was not on that account of less value in the eyes of God. For it is quite clear that the cost or workmanship of these contributed nothing to it. Those beginners, therefore, who go on well, do not rely on visible instruments. Neither do they burden themselves with them, neither do they seek to know more than is necessary for them, so that they may act rightly, for their sole object is to be well with God and to please Him. Their avarice consists in that. With a noble generosity they give away their possessions, and their delight is to learn how to want all things for the love of God and their neighbor, disposing of everything according to the laws of this virtue. Because, as I have said, the sole object they have in view is real perfection, to please God in all things and themselves in nothing. The soul, however, cannot be perfectly purified from these imperfections any more than from the others, until God shall have led it into the passive purgation of this obscure night. But it is expedient that the soul, so far as it can, should labor on its own part to purify and perfect itself, that it may merit from God to be taken under His divine care, and to be healed from those imperfections of itself it cannot remedy. For after all the efforts of the soul, it cannot by any exertions of its own actively purify itself so as to be in the slightest degree qualified for the divine union of perfection in the love of God, if God Himself does not take it into His own hands and purify it in the obscure fire, as I am going to explain. End of Section 4. Section 5 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Book 1, Chapter 4, of the Imperfection of Luxury, spiritually understood. Many beginners fall into other imperfections, over and above those in connection with the capital sins. I pass them over now to avoid prolixity, touching on some of the principal ones, which are, as it were, the source and origin of the rest. As to the sin of luxury, passing over what it is to commit it, my object being to speak of those imperfections which have to be purged away in the obscure night, beginners fall into many imperfections which may be called spiritual luxury. Not that it is so in fact, but because it is felt and experienced sometimes in the flesh, owing to frailty, when the soul is the recipient of spiritual communications. For very often, in the midst of their spiritual exercises, and when they cannot help themselves, the impure motions of sensuality are felt, and sometimes even when they are deeply absorbed in prayer, or engaged in receiving the sacraments of penance and the Eucharist. These motions, not being in their power, proceed from one of three sources. They proceed occasionally, though but rarely, and in persons of delicate constitutions, from sensible sweetness in spiritual things. For when sense and spirit are both delighted together, the whole nature of man is moved in that delectation according to its measure and character. The mind is moved to delight itself in God, that is the higher part of our nature, and sensuality, which is the lower part, is moved towards sensible gratification, because it knows and admits of none other. And so it happens that the soul, while in spirit it is praying, is in the senses troubled, to its great disgust, with the rebellious movements of the flesh passively. As these two parts, the higher and the lower, form but one subject, man, they mutually participate in their respective passions, each in its own way. For, as the philosopher tells us, all that is received according to the capacity of the recipient. And so, in these beginnings, and even when the soul has made some progress, the sensitive part, being still imperfect, when spiritual delight flows into the soul, mingles occasionally of its own therewith. But when the sensitive is already cleansed in the purgation of the obscure night, it is no more subject to these infirmities, because it receives so abundantly of the Spirit of God, that it seems rather to be received into that Spirit itself, as into that which is greater and grander. Thus it possesses everything in the way of the Spirit, in an admirable manner of which it partakes, united with God. The second source of these rebellious motions is the evil spirit, who, in order to disquiet the soul during prayer, or when it is preparing for it, causes these filthy movements of our lower nature, and these, when in any degree admitted, are injury enough. Some persons not only relax in their prayers through fear of these movements, which is the object of Satan when he undertakes to assail them, but even neglect them altogether, for they imagine that they are more liable to these assaults during prayer than at other times. This is certainly true, for he then assails them more than at other times in order to lead them to intermit their prayers. This is not all, for he represents to them most vividly the very filthiest images, and occasionally in close relations with certain spiritual things and persons, the thought whereof is profitable to the soul, that he may terrify and crush them. Some are so grievously assailed that they dare not dwell upon anything, for it becomes at once a stumbling block to them, especially those who are of a melancholy temperament. These are so afflicted as to be objects of the deepest pity. When melancholy is the occasion of these visitations of Satan, men in general cannot be delivered from them till their bodily health is improved, unless they shall have entered on the obscure night, which purifies them wholly. The third source of these depraved movements which war against the soul is usually the fear of them, which men have conceived beforehand. This fear, which a sudden remembrance occasions, in what they see, speak, or think of, makes them suffer these trials without fault on their part. Sometimes, when spiritual persons are speaking of spiritual things, or doing good works, they become conscious of a certain energy and elasticity arising out of the recollection of persons whom they have seen, and they go on with a certain measure of vain joy. This also proceeds from spiritual luxury in the sense I speak of, and is accompanied at times by a certain complacency of the will. Some, too, form spiritual friendships with others, the source of which is this luxury, and not spirituality. We may know it to be so by observing whether the remembrance of that affection increases our recollection and love of God, or remorse of conscience. When this affection is purely spiritual, the love of God increases with it, and the more we think of it, the more we think of God, and the greater our longing for Him, for the one grows with the other. The Spirit of God has this property, that it increases good by good, because there is a resemblance and harmony between them. But when this affection springs out of mere sensuality, its effects are quite opposite. For the more it grows, the more is the love of God diminished, and the resemblance of him also. For if this earthly love increases, that of God cools down, and men forget him by reason of that affection of sense, and the remorse of conscience is the result. On the other hand, if the love of God increases, the human love decreases and is forgotten. For as they are contrary the one to the other, not only do they not help each other, but the one which predominates suppresses the other, and strengthens itself, as philosophers explain it. And so our Saviour tells us in the Gospel, saying, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." That love which grows out of sensuality ends in the same, and that which is spiritual ends in the Spirit of God, and increases it in the soul. This is the difference between these two affections, whereby we may distinguish between them. When the soul enters into the obscure night, these affections are ruled by reason. That night strengthens and purifies the affection which is according to God, and removes, destroys, or mortifies the other. In the beginning, both are lost sight of, as I shall explain hereafter. End of Section 5. Section 6 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 5, of the Imperfection of Anger. Many beginners, because of their inordinate appetite for spiritual sweetness, generally commit many imperfections in the matter of anger. For when spiritual things minister to them no more sweetness and delight, they naturally become peevish, and in that bitterness of spirit prove a burden to themselves in all they do. Trifles make them angry, and they are at all times intolerable to all about them. This happens to them generally after great sweetness in prayer, and so, when that sensible sweetness is past and gone, their natural temper is soured and rendered morose. They are like a babe weaned from the breast, which he found so sweet. When this natural feeling of displeasure is not permitted to grow, there is no sin, but only imperfection, which will have to be purged away in the hardship and aridities of the obscure night. There are spiritual persons, too, who fall into another kind of anger. They are angry with other people's faults, with a sort of unquiet zeal for censure. They are occasionally moved to blame them, and even do so with anger, constituting themselves guardians of virtue. All this is contrary to spiritual meekness. Others, again, when they detect their own imperfections, become angry at themselves, with an impatience that is not humble. They are so impatient with their shortcomings that they would be saints in a day. Many of these form many and grand resolutions, but, being self-confident and not humble, the more they resolve, the more they fall, and the more angry at themselves they become. They have not patience enough to wait for God's help. This is also opposed to spiritual meekness. There is no perfect remedy for this but in the obscure night. There are, however, some people who are so patient and who advance so slowly in the desire for spiritual progress that God wishes they were not so patient. End of Section 6. Section 7 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 6, of the Imperfections of Spiritual Gluttony. I have much to say of the fourth capital sin, which is spiritual gluttony, for there is scarcely one among beginners, however well he may go on, who does not fall into many of the imperfections connected with this sin, in his case owing to that sensible sweetness which is at first to be found in spiritual exercises. Many beginners, delighting in the sweetness and joy of their spiritual occupations, strive after spiritual sweetness rather than after pure and true devotion, which is that which God regards and accepts in the whole course of the spiritual way. For this reason, over and above their imperfection in seeking after sweetness in devotion, that spirit of gluttony, which has taken possession of them, forces them to overstep the limits of moderation, within which virtue is acquired and consists. For, allured by the delights they then experience, some of them kill themselves by penances, and others weaken themselves by fasting. They take upon themselves more than they can bear, without rule or advice. They conceal their austerities from those whom they are bound to obey, and some even practice them when they are expressly commanded to abstain. These are full of imperfections, unreasonable people, who undervalue submission and obedience, which is the penance of reason and judgment, and therefore a more acceptable and sweet sacrifice unto God than all the acts of bodily penance. Bodily penance is full of imperfections when the penance of the will is neglected, for men undertake it merely for the sweetness which attends it. Inasmuch then as all extremes are vicious, and as in this course of conduct men follow their own will, the consequences are that they grow in vice, and not in virtue. At least they minister to their spiritual gluttony and pride, for they do not walk in the way of obedience. The devil so deceives many of them by exciting their gluttony through this sweetness, which he increases, that, since they cannot obey, they either change or vary or add to what is commanded them. So hard and bitter is obedience become. The evil has so grown upon some that they lose all desire to do their spiritual duties the instant obedience enjoins them, because their sole satisfaction consisted in following their own inclinations, which, in their case, had better, perhaps, have been unattended to. Many of these importune their spiritual directors to allow them to do what they have set their minds upon. They extort that permission by force, and if it be refused, they mope like children, and become discontented. They think they are not serving God whenever they are thwarted in their wishes. These persons, clinging to sweetness and their own will, the moment they are contradicted and directed according to the will of God, become fretful, faint-hearted, and then fall away. They imagine that to please and gratify themselves is to serve and please God. Others also there are, who, by reason of this spiritual gluttony, are so ignorant of their own meanness and misery, and so insensible to that loving fear and reverence due to the majesty of God, that they are not afraid to insist on being allowed by their confessors to confess and communicate frequently. And what is much worse, they very often dare to communicate without the leave and approbation of the minister and steward of Christ, purely out of their own head, and conceal the fact from their director. This eagerness for communion makes them confess themselves carelessly, for they are more anxious to communicate anyhow than to communicate in pureness and perfection. It would be more profitable for them, and a holier course, to entreat their confessors not to enjoin such frequent communions. Though the better way between these two extremes is to be humble and resigned. This excessive boldness leads to great evil, and men may well be in fear of some chastisement for their rashness. These persons, when they communicate, strive with all their might to find some sensible sweetness in the act, instead of worshipping in humility and praising God within themselves. So much are they given up to this, that they think, when they derive no sensible sweetness from communion, that they have done nothing, so meanly do they think of God. Neither do they understand that the best of the blessings of the most holy sacrament is that which touches the senses, and that the invisible grace it confers is far greater. For God frequently withholds these sensible favors from men, that they may fix the eyes of faith upon Himself. But these persons will feel and taste God as if He were palpable and accessible to them, not only in communion, but in all their other acts of devotion. All this is a very great imperfection, and directly at variance with the requirements of God, which demand the purest faith. They conduct themselves in the same way when they are praying, for they imagine that the whole business of prayer consists in sensible devotion, and this they strive to obtain with all their might, wearing out their brains and perplexing all the faculties of their souls. When they miss that sensible devotion, they are cast down, thinking they have done nothing. This effort after sweetness destroys true devotion and spirituality, which consist in perseverance in prayer, with patience and humility, mistrusting self solely to please God. And therefore, when they once miss their accustomed sweetness in prayer, or in any other act of religion, they feel a sort of repugnance to resume it, and sometimes cease from it altogether. In short, they are like children who are not influenced by reason, but by their inclinations. They waste themselves in the search after spiritual consolation, and are never satisfied with reading good books, taking up one meditation after another, in the pursuit of sensible sweetness in the things of God. God refuses it to them most justly, wisely, and lovingly, for if He did not, this spiritual gluttony on their part would grow into great evils. For this reason, it is most expedient that they should enter into the obscure night, that they may be cleansed from this childishness. They who are bent on sensible sweetness labor under another very great imperfection, weakness and remissness on the rugged road of the cross. For the soul that is given to sweetness naturally sets its face against the pain of self-denial. They labor under many other imperfections also, which have their origin here, of which our Lord will heal them in due time, through temptation, aridities, and trials, elements of the obscure night. I will not enlarge upon them here, that I may avoid prolixity. But this will I say, that spiritual soberness and temperance produce a far different temper of mortification, of fear and submission in all things, showing us that the perfection and value of things consist not in the multitude thereof, but in knowing how to deny ourselves in them. Spiritual men must labor after this with all their might, until it shall please God to purify them by leading them into the obscure night. And I hasten on with the description of these imperfections, that I may enter on the explanation of it. End of Section 7. Section 8 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Of the imperfections of envy and spiritual sloth. Beginners are not free from many imperfections in the matter of envy and spiritual sloth. Many of them are wont to experience emotions of displeasure at the contemplation of other men's goodness. They are sensibly afflicted when others outstrip them on the spiritual road. They cannot endure to hear them praised. They are vexed with other men's virtues, and are sometimes unable to restrain themselves from contradiction when they are commended. They depreciate them as much as they can, and feel acutely because they are not thought so well of themselves, for they wish to be preferred above all others. All this is at variance with that charity of which the Apostle says, "It rejoiceth with the truth." If charity admits of envy at all, it is a holy envy that makes us grieve that we have not the virtues that others have, but still rejoicing that they have them, and glad that others outstrip us in the race, that they may serve God, we being so full of imperfection ourselves. As to spiritual sloth, beginners are wont to find their most spiritual occupations irksome, and they avoid them therefore as repugnant to their desire for sensible sweetness. For being addicted to it in spiritual things, they loathe them when this sweetness fails. If they miss but once their accustomed sweetness in prayer, it is expedient that God should deprive them of it at last. They will not resume it. At other times they omit it, and return to it with a bad grace. Thus, under the influence of spiritual sloth, they turn aside from the way of perfection, which is the denial of their will and pleasure for God, preferring to it the gratification of their own will, which they serve herein rather than the will of God. Many of these will have it that God should will what they will, and are afflicted when they must will what He wills, and reluctantly submit their own to His will.
The result is that they frequently imagine that what is not according to their will is also not according to the will of God, and, on the other hand, that what pleases them is also pleasing unto God. They measure Him by themselves, and not themselves by Him, in direct contradiction to the teaching of the gospel. He that shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. That is, he who shall give up his own will for God shall have it, and he who will have it, he shall have it never. They also find it wearisome to obey when they are commanded to do what they like not, and because they walk in the way of consolation and spiritual sweetness, they are too weak for the rough trials of perfection. They are like persons delicately nurtured, who avoid with heavy hearts all that is hard and rugged, and are offended at the cross wherein the joys of the Spirit consist. The more spiritual the work they have to do, the more irksome do they feel it to be. And because they will walk at their ease, gratifying their will along the spiritual road, to enter on the straight way that leadeth unto life is repugnant to their feelings and produces heaviness of heart. Let this account of the many imperfections under which they labor, who are in the first state of beginners, suffice to show them how necessary it is for them that God should bring them to the state of proficience, which He effects when He leads them into the obscure night. In that night He weans them from the breasts of sweetness, in pure aridities and interior darkness, cleanses them from all these imperfections and childish ways, and by a way most difficult from their own, makes them grow in virtue. After all our exertions to mortify ourselves in our actions and passions, our success will not be perfect, or even great, until God Himself shall do it for us in the purgation of the obscure night. May God be pleased to give me His light, that I may speak profitably of this. For I have great need of it while treating of a night so obscure and a subject so difficult. End of Section 8. Section 9 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 8. Explanation of the first line of the first stanza. In an obscure night. In an obscure night. This night, I have already said that it is contemplation, produces in spiritual men two sorts of darkness or purgations conformable to the two divisions of man's nature into sensitive and spiritual. Thus one night, or sensitive purgation, wherein the soul is purified or detached, will be of the senses, harmonizing them with the spirit. The other is that night, or spiritual purgation, wherein the soul is purified or detached in the spirit, and which harmonizes and disposes the soul for union with God in love. The sensitive night is common, and the lot of many. These are the beginners, of whom I shall first speak. The spiritual night is the portion of very few, and they are those who have made some progress, exercised therein, of whom I shall speak hereafter. The first night, or purgation, is bitter and terrible to sense. The second is not to be compared with it, for it is much more awful to the spirit, as I shall soon show. But as the night of sense is the first in order and in fact, I shall discuss it briefly, for being of ordinary occurrence, it is the matter of many treatises, that I may proceed with the discussion of the spiritual night, of which very little has been said, either by word of mouth or in writing, and of which little is known, even by experience. As the conduct of beginners in the way of God is mean, in harmony with their tastes and self-love, and as God wills their advancement, and to draw them out of their mean way of loving Him to the heights of the divine love, to rescue them from the groveling work of sense and reflections, where they so scantily and unseemlily feel after Him, to elevate them to the practice of spirituality, where they may commune with Him more fully, and in greater freedom from their imperfections, being now experienced in the ways of virtue, persevering in meditation and prayer, through the sweetness of which they have been able to disentangle their affections from the things of this world, and acquired some spiritual strength so as to curb their desires, and being now capable of bearing their burdens and enduring aridities, without going back to that more pleasant time when their spiritual exercises abounded in delights, and when the sun of divine favors shone more clearly upon them as they think, God changes that light into darkness, and seals up the door of the fountain of the sweet waters of the Spirit, which they tasted in God as often and as long as they wished. For when they were weak and tender, this door was then not shut, as it is written, Behold, I have given before thee an opened door, which no man can shut, because thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. Now, at last, God leaves them in darkness so deep that they know not whither to betake themselves with their imaginations and reflections. They cannot now advance a single step with their meditation, as they did before, the inward sense being, as it were, suffocated in that night, and abandoned to dryness so great that they have no more any joy or sweetness in their spiritual exercises, as they had before, and in their place they now find nothing but insipidity and bitterness. For now God, looking upon them as somewhat grown in grace, weans them from the breasts that they may become strong, and cast their swaddling clothes aside. He carries them in his arms no longer, and shows them how to walk alone. All this is strange to them, for all things seem to go against them. Recollected persons enter the obscure night sooner than others, after they have begun their spiritual course, because they are kept at a greater distance from the occasions of falling away, and because they correct more quickly their worldly desires, which it is requisite to do even at the commencement of the blessed night of sense. In general, there elapses no great length of time after they have begun before they enter the night of sense, and most of them do enter it, because they generally suffer aridities. The Holy Scriptures throughout, but especially in the Psalms and the prophetical books, furnish many illustrations of the night of sense. It is so common. But, to avoid prolixity, I omit them for the present, though in the course of my treatise I shall have occasion to make use of some of them. End of Section 9.
Section 10 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 9. Of the signs by which it may be known that the spiritual man is walking in the way of this night, or sensitive purgation. But as these aridities may frequently proceed, not from this night and purgation of the sensitive appetite, but from sin and imperfection, from weakness or lukewarmness, from some physical derangement or bodily indisposition, I shall here propose certain signs by which we may ascertain whether a particular aridity proceeds from the purgation of sense or from any of the sources I have just enumerated. There are 3 chief signs. The first is when men find no comfort in the things of God, and none also in created things. For when God leads the soul into the obscure night in order to wean it from sweetness and to purge away its sensitive desires, He does not allow it to find sweetness or comfort anywhere. It is then probable, in such a case, that this aridity is not the result of sin or of imperfections recently committed, for if it were, we should feel some inclination or desire for other things than those of God. Whenever we give reins to our desires in the way of any imperfection, our desires are instantly attracted to it, be it much or little, in proportion to the affection we regard it with. But still, inasmuch as this absence of pleasure in the things of heaven and of earth may proceed from bodily indisposition or a melancholy temperament, which frequently cause dissatisfaction in all things, the second sign and condition become necessary. The second sign and condition of this purgation are that the memory dwells ordinarily upon God with a painful anxiety and carefulness. The soul thinks it is not serving God, but going backwards, because it is no longer conscious of any sweetness in the things of God. In that case it is clear that this weariness of spirit and aridity are not the results of weakness and tepidity. For the peculiarity of tepidity is the absence of great application to, and of inferior solicitude for, the things of God. There is, therefore, a great difference between aridity and lukewarmness, for the latter consists in great remissness of the will and resolution, and in the want of all solicitude about serving God. But the purgative aridity is accompanied in general by a painful anxiety, because the soul thinks that it is not serving God. Though this be occasionally increased by constitutional melancholy, so it sometimes happens, yet it is not for that reason without its purgative effects on the desires, because the soul is deprived of all sweetness, and its sole anxieties are referred to God. For when mere bodily indisposition is the case, all that it does is to cause distrust and the ruin of the physical constitution, without those desires of serving God which belong to the purgative aridity. In this aridity, though the sensitive part of man be greatly depressed, weak and sluggish in good works, by reason of the little satisfaction they furnish, the spirit is, nevertheless, ready and strong. The cause of this aridity is that God transfers to the spirit the goods and energies of the senses, which, having no natural fitness for it, become dry, parched up, and empty. For the sensitive nature of man is not naturally adapted for that which belongs to the spirit simply. Thus the spirit having been tasted, the flesh becomes insipid and remiss, but the spirit, having received its proper nourishment, becomes strong, more vigilant and careful than before, lest there should be any negligence in serving God. At first it is not conscious of any spiritual sweetness and delight, but rather of aridities and distaste, because of the novelty of the change. The spiritual palate, having been accustomed to sensible sweetness, the eyes of the soul are still fixed upon it. And because the spiritual palate is not prepared and purified for so delicious a taste, until it shall have been for some time disposed for it in this arid and obscure night, it cannot taste of the spiritual good, but rather of aridity and distaste, because it misses that which it enjoyed with so much facility before. These, whom God begins to lead through the solitudes of the wilderness, resemble the children of Israel, who, though God began to feed them, as soon as they were come into the wilderness with the manna of heaven, which, serving every man's will, was turned to what every man liked, were more sensible to the loss of the onions and flesh of Egypt, for their taste had been formed to them and had revelled in them, than to the delicious sweetness of the angelical food. So in the midst of the manna they wept and bewailed the flesh pots of Egypt, saying, We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt, free cost. The cucumbers come into our mind, and the melons, and the leeks, and the onions, and the garlic. Our appetite becomes so depraved that we long for miserable trifles, and loathe the unchangeable good of heaven. But when these aridities arise in the purgative way of the sensitive appetite, though the spirit is at first without any sweetness, for the reasons I have given, yet it is conscious of strength and energy to act, because of the substantial nature of its interior food, which is the commencement of contemplation, obscure and dry to the senses. This contemplation is in general secret, and unknown to him who is admitted into it. Together with this aridity and emptiness, the soul feels a longing for solitude and repose, being unable to fix the thoughts on anything distinctly, or even to desire to do so. Now, if they who are in this state knew how to be quiet, to disregard every interior and exterior work, the accomplishment of which they labor after, and to be without solicitude about everything but the resignation of themselves into the hands of God, and a loving interior obedience to His voice, they would have, in this tranquillity, a most delicious taste of interior refreshing. This refreshing is so delicate that, in general, it eludes our perceptions if we are in any degree anxious to feel it, for it works in the soul when most tranquil and free, and is like the air, which vanishes whenever we shut our hands to grasp it. the words of the bridegroom, which he addressed to the bride, are applicable to this matter. Turn away thy eyes from me, for they have made me flee away. Such is God's way of bringing the soul into this state. The road by which he leads it is so different from the first, that if it will do anything in its own strength, it will hinder rather than aid his work. The matter was far otherwise once. The reason is this: God works in the soul, in the state of contemplation, that is, when it advances from meditation to the state of the proficience, in such a way as to seem to have bound up all the interior faculties, leaving no support in the intellect, no sweetness in the will, no reflections in the memory. Therefore, at this time, all that the soul can do of itself ends only in disturbing the interior peace, and hindering the work which God is carrying on in the spirit amid the dryness of sense. This peace, being spiritual and delicate, affects a work that is quiet and delicate, pacific and utterly alien to the former delights, which were most palpable and sensible. This is that peace of which the psalmist spoke when he said, God will speak in me, for he will speak peace unto his people. This brings us to the third sign. The third sign we have for ascertaining whether this aridity be the purgation of sense is an inability to meditate and make reflections, and to excite the imagination, as before, notwithstanding all the efforts we may make. For God begins now to communicate himself, no longer through the channel of sense, as he did formerly, in consecutive reflections, by which we arranged and divided our knowledge, but in pure spirit, which admits not of successive ideas, and in an act of pure contemplation, to which neither the interior nor the exterior senses of our lower nature can ascend. Hence it is that the fancy and the imagination cannot support or commence any reflections, nor use them ever afterwards. It is understood here that this embarrassment and aversion of the senses does not arise out of any bodily ailment. When it arises from this, the indisposition, which is always changeable, having ceased, the powers of the soul recover their former energies, and find their previous satisfactions at once. It is otherwise in the purgation of the appetite, for as soon as we enter upon this, the inability to make our meditations continually grows. It is true that this purgation is not continuous in some persons, for they are not altogether without sensible sweetness and comfort. Their weakness renders their rapid weaning inexpedient. Nevertheless, it grows upon them more and more, and the operations of sense diminish, if it be that they are advancing to perfection. They, however, who are not walking in the way of contemplation, meet with a very difficult treatment, for the night of aridities is not continuous with them. They are sometimes in it, and sometimes not. They are at one time unable to meditate, and at another able as before. God leads these persons into this night only to try them and to humble them, and to correct their desires, that they may not grow up spiritual gluttons, and not for the purpose of leading them into the spiritual way, which is contemplation. God does not elevate to perfect contemplation every one that is tried in the spiritual way, and he alone knoweth why. Hence it is that these persons are never wholly weaned from the breasts of meditations and reflections, but only at intervals and at certain seasons. End of Section 10. Section 11 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 10. How they are to conduct themselves who have entered the obscure night. During the aridity of the night of sense, when God effects the change of which I have spoken, when he leads the soul out of the way of sense into that of the spirit, from meditation to contemplation, where it is helpless so far as its own powers are concerned, spiritual persons have to endure great afflictions, not so much because they are in the state of aridity, but because they are afraid that they have missed the way, thinking that they are spiritually ruined, and that God has forsaken them, only because they find no support or consolation in holy things. Under these circumstances, they weary themselves and strive, as they were wont, to fix the powers of the soul with some satisfaction upon some object of meditation. They think when they cannot do this, and are not conscious of their labor, that they are doing nothing, but with great dislike and interior unwillingness on the part of the soul, which enjoys its state of quietness and rest. While they change from one condition, they make no progress in the other, because by exerting their own spirit, they lose that spirit which they had in tranquility and peace. They are like a man who does his work over again, or who goes out of a city that he may enter it once more, or who lets go what he has caught in hunting that he may hunt it again. Their labors are in vain, for they will find nothing, and that because they are turning back to their former habits. Under these circumstances, if they meet with no one who understands their case, these persons fall away and abandon the right road, or become weak, or at least put hindrances in the way of their further advancement, because they make efforts to proceed in their former way of meditation, fatiguing their natural powers beyond measure. They think that their state is the result of negligence or of sin. All their efforts are now in vain, because God is leading them by another and a very difficult road, that of contemplation. Their first road was that of discursive reflection, but no imagination or reasoning can reach the second. It behooves those who find themselves in this condition to take courage and persevere in patience, but put their confidence in God, who never forsakes those who seek Him with a pure and upright heart. Neither will He withhold from them all that is necessary for them on this road until He brings them to the clear and pure light of love, which He will show them in that other obscure night of the Spirit, if they shall merit an entrance into it. The conduct to be observed by spiritual men in the night of sense is this: let them in no wise have recourse to meditations, for the time is now past, and let them leave their soul in quietness and repose, though they may think they are doing nothing, that they are losing time, and that their tepidity is the reason of their unwillingness to employ their thoughts. They will do enough if they keep patience, and persevere in prayer. All they have to do is to keep their soul free, unembarrassed, and at rest from all thoughts and all knowledge, not anxious about what they shall think or meditate, contenting themselves with directing their attention lovingly and calmly towards God, and all this without anxiety or effort, or immoderate desire to feel and taste His presence. For all such efforts disquiet the soul, and distract it from the calm repose and sweet tranquility of contemplation belonging to their present state. And though they may have many scruples that they are wasting time, and that it may be better for them to betake themselves to some other occupation, seeing that in prayer and meditation they are becoming helpless, yet let them be patient with themselves, and remain quiet, for what they are uneasy about is their own satisfaction and liberty of spirit. If they were now to exert their interior faculties, they would only impede and ruin the good which, in that repose, God is working in the soul. For if a man, while sitting for his portrait, cannot be still, but moves about, the painter will never depict his face, and even what he may have done will be spoiled. So when the soul interiorly reposes, every action and passion, or anxious consideration at that time, will distract and disturb it, and make it feel the dryness and emptiness of sense. The more efforts it makes to acquire support in affection and knowledge, the more it will feel the deficiency which cannot now be supplied in that way. It is therefore expedient for the soul which is in this condition not to be troubled because its faculties have become useless. Yea, rather it should desire that they may become so quickly. For by offering no impediment to the operation of infused contemplation, to which God is now admitting it, the soul is refreshed in peaceful abundance, and set on fire with the spirit of love, which this obscure and secret contemplation induces and establishes within it. Still, I do not mean to lay down a general rule for the cessation from meditation. That should occur when meditation is no longer feasible, and only then, when our Lord, either in the way of purgation or affliction, or of the most perfect contemplation, shall make it impossible. At other times, and on other occasions, this support must be had recourse to, namely, meditation on the life and passion of Christ, which is the best means of purification and of patience and of security on the road, and an admirable aid to the highest contemplation. Contemplation is nothing else but the secret, pacific, and loving infusion of God, which, if it be admitted, will set the soul on fire with the spirit of love, as I shall show in the explanation of the following verse. End of section 11.
Section 12 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 11. Stanza 1. With anxious love inflamed. The burning fire of love, in general, is not felt at first, for it has not begun to burn, either because of our natural want of purity, or because the soul, not understanding its own state, has not given it a peaceful rest within itself. Sometimes, however, whether that be the case or not, a certain anxiety about God arises, and the more it grows, the more the soul feels itself touched and inflamed with the love of God, without knowing how or whence that feeling arises, except that at times this burning so inflames that it longs earnestly after God. David in this night said of himself, "My heart hath been inflamed, and my reins have been changed, and I am brought to nothing, and I knew not." That is, my heart hath been inflamed in the love of contemplation. My reins, that is, my tastes and affections also, have been changed from the sensitive to the spiritual way by this holy dryness, and in my cessation from them all. And I am brought to nothing, and I knew not. The soul, as I have just said, not knowing the way it goeth, sees itself brought to nothing as to all things of heaven and earth, wherein it delighted before, and on fire with love, not knowing how. And because occasionally this fire of love grows in the spirit greatly, the longings of the soul for God are so deep that the very bones seem to dry up in that thirst, the bodily health to wither, the natural warmth and energies to perish in the intensity of that thirst of love. The soul feels it to be a living thirst. Such also was the feeling of David when he said, "My soul hath thirsted after the strong living God." It is as if he had said, "My thirst is a strong living thirst." We may say of this thirst that being a living thirst, it kills. Though this thirst is not continuously, but only occasionally, violent, nevertheless it is always felt in some degree. I commenced by observing that this love, in general, is not felt at first, but only the aridity and emptiness of which I am speaking. And then, instead of love, which is afterwards enkindled, what the soul feels amidst its aridities and the emptiness of its faculties is a general painful anxiety about God, and a certain misgiving that it is not serving Him. But a soul anxious and afflicted for His sake is a sacrifice pleasing unto God. Secret contemplation keeps the soul in this state of anxiety, until, in the course of time, having purged the sensitive nature of man, in some degree, of its natural forces and affections by means of the aridities it occasions, it shall have kindled within it this divine love. But in the meantime, like a sick man in the hands of his physician, all it has to do, in the obscure night and dry purgation of the desire, is to suffer, healing its many imperfections and practicing many virtues, that it may become meet for this divine love, of which I speak while explaining the following line. O happy lot! When God establishes the soul in the obscure night, that he may purify, prepare, and subdue its inferior state, and unite it to the Spirit, by depriving it of light, and causing it to cease from meditation, as he afterwards establishes it also in the spiritual night, that he may purify the spirit, and prepare it for union with God. The soul acquires such great advantages, though it seems not so, that it looks upon it as a great happiness to have escaped from the bondage of the senses in that happy night, and therefore it sings, O happy lot! It is necessary now for us to point out the benefits which accrue to the soul in this night, and for the sake of which it pronounces itself happy in having passed through it. All these benefits are comprised in these words, Forth unobserved I went. This going forth of the soul is to be understood of that subjection to sense under which it labored when it was seeking after God in weak, limited, and fitful ways, for such are the ways of man's sensitive nature. It then fell at every step into 1,000 imperfections and ignorances, as I showed while speaking of the 7 capital sins, from all of which the spiritual man is delivered in the obscure night which quenches all desire in all things whatsoever, and deprives him of all his lights in meditation, and brings with it other innumerable blessings towards the acquirement of virtue. It will be a great joy and comfort to him who travels on this road to observe how that which seems so rugged and harsh, so contrary to spiritual sweetness, works in him so great a good. This good flows from going forth, as to all affections and operations of the soul, from all created things, in this obscure night, and journeying towards those which are eternal, which is a great happiness and a great good. In the first place, because the desires are extinguished in all things, and in the second place, because they are few who persevere and enter in at the narrow gate, by the strait way that leadeth to life. How narrow is the gate, and strait is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. The narrow gate is the night of sense. The soul detaches itself from sense that it may enter into that night, directing itself by faith, which is stranger to all sense, that it may afterwards travel along the straight road of the other night of the Spirit, by which it advances toward God in most pure faith, which is the means of the divine union. This road, because so straight, dark, and terrible, for there is no comparison between its trials and darkness and those of the night of sense, is traveled by very few, but its blessings are so much the more. I proceed now to speak with the utmost brevity of the blessings of the night of sense, that I may pass on to the other. End of Section 12. Section 13 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 12, of the Benefits of the Night of Sense. This night and purgation of the appetite is full of happiness to the soul, involving grand benefits, though it seems as if all were lost. As Abraham made a great feast on the day of Isaac's weaning, so there is joy in heaven when God takes a soul out of its swaddling clothes, when he takes his arms from under it and makes it walk alone, and he denies it the milk of the breast and the delicate food of children, and gives it bread with the crust to eat. When he makes it eat the bread of the strong, which is presented, in the aridities and darkness of sense, to the spirit emptied and dried of all sensible sweetness, namely the bread of infused contemplation. This is the first and principal benefit, from which almost all the others flow. Of these, the first is a knowledge of our own selves and our own vileness. For over and above that this knowledge ordinarily includes those favors which God bestows on the soul, these aridities and emptiness of the faculties as to their former abounding, and the difficulty which good works present, bring the soul to a knowledge of its own vileness and misery, which in the season of prosperity it saw not. This truth is vividly shadowed forth in the book of Exodus. There we read that God, willing to humble the people and bring them to a knowledge of themselves, commanded them to lay aside their ornaments and festival attire, which they ordinarily wore in the wilderness, saying, "Lay aside thy ornaments," that is, lay aside thy holiday garments, and put on thy common vestments, that thou mayest know what treatment thou hast deserved. It is as if he said to the people, "Inasmuch as the ornaments you wear, being those of joy and festivity, are the cause why you think not meanly of yourselves, you really are mean, lay them aside, so that henceforth, clad in vile garments, you may acknowledge that you deserve nothing better, and also who and what you are." Here the soul learns the reality of its own misery, which before it knew not. For in the day of its festivity, when it found great sweetness, comfort, and help in God, it was highly satisfied and pleased, thinking that it rendered some service to God. For though it may not explicitly say so, yet, on account of the satisfaction it feels, some such feeling still clings to it. But when it has put on the garments of heaviness, of aridity, and abandonment, when its previous lights have become darkness, it will then possess in reality that excellent and necessary virtue of self-knowledge, counting itself for nothing, and having no satisfaction in itself, because it sees that of itself it does and can do nothing. This diminished satisfaction with self, and the affliction it feels because it thinks that it is not serving God, God esteems more highly than all its former delights and all its good works, however great they may have been. For then many imperfections and ignorances clung to it. But now in the garb of aridity it derives not only those fruits of which I am speaking, but others also of which I shall presently speak, much more than I can speak of, as from proper source and fount of self-knowledge. In the next place, the soul learns to commune with God with more reverence and gentleness, and this is always necessary when it converses with the Most High. Now in its prosperous days of sweetness and consolation, the soul was less observant of reverence, for the favors, of which it was then the object, rendered the appetite somewhat bold with God, and less reverential than it should have been. Thus it was with Moses when he heard the voice of God, for carried away by the delight he felt, he ventured, without further consideration, to draw near, till God commanded him to stop, saying, "Come not nigh hither. Put off the shoes from thy feet." This teaches us how reverently and discreetly, in spiritual detachment, we are to converse with God. When Moses had become obedient to the voice, he remained so reverent and considerate that not only did he refrain from advancing, but, in the words of the Scripture, durst not look at God. For having put off the shoes of desire and sweetness, he recognized profoundly his own meanness in the sight of God, for such a state of mind became him, when about to listen to the divine words. The temper of mind to which Job was brought, in order that he might converse with God, was not of that delight and grandeur, such as he had before. God left him in misery, naked on a dunghill, persecuted by his friends, filled with sorrow and grief, covered with worms. Then it was that the Most High, who lifteth up the poor out of the dunghill, was pleased to communicate himself to Job in greater abundance and sweetness, revealing to him the deep mysteries of his wisdom, as he had never done before in the days of Job's prosperity. And now that I am on this subject, I must here point out another great benefit of the obscure night and aridity of the sensitive appetite. It is this: God, verifying the words of the prophet, "Then my light shall rise up in darkness," enlightens the soul, so that it shall confess not only its own misery and meanness, but also his grandeur and majesty. Not only does the extinction of desires and the suppression of sensible joy and consolation purify the intellect for reception of the truth, for sensible joys and desires even of spiritual things obscure and perplex the mind, but the trials and aridities of sense also enlighten and quicken the intellect. As it is written, "Vexation alone shall make you understand what you hear." Vexation shall make us understand how God in his divine wisdom proceeds to instruct a soul, emptied and cleansed, for such it must be before it can be the recipient of the divine influences, in a supernatural way, in the obscure and arid night of contemplation, which he could not do before, when it was given up to its former sweetness and joys. The prophet sets this truth before us with great clearness, saying, "Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand the teaching? Them that are weaned from the milk, that are drawn away from the breasts." The temper of mind, then, meet for the divine influence, is not so much the milk of spiritual sweetness, nor the breasts of sweet reflections in the sensitive powers, such as the soul once enjoyed, as the absence of both, the one and the other. And therefore, if we would listen to the voice of the great King with due reverence, the soul must stand upright, and not lean on the affections of sense for support. We must be like the prophet, who said of himself, "I will stand upon my watch, and fix my foot upon the tower, and I will watch to see what will be said to me." To stand upon the watch is to cast off all desires. To fix the foot is to cease from all reflections of sense, that we may behold and understand what God will speak to us. Thus out of this obscure night springs first the knowledge of oneself, and on that, as on a foundation, is built up the knowledge of God. "Let me know myself," saith St. Augustine, "and I shall then know thee, O my God." As philosophers say, one extreme is known by another. In order to show more fully how effectual is the night of sense, in its aridity and desolation, to enlighten the soul more and more, I produce the words of the psalmist, which so clearly describe the power of this night in bringing men to the knowledge of God. In a desert land, and where there is no way and no water, so in the sanctuary have I come before thee, to see thy power and thy glory. The psalmist does not say, and it is worthy of observation, that his previous sweetness and delight were any dispositions meet for the knowledge of the glory of God, but rather that aridity and weaning from the sensitive faculties, which are here meant by the barren land. Neither does he say that his reflections and meditations on divine things, with which he was once familiar, had led him to the knowledge and contemplation of God's power, but rather his inability to meditate on God, to form reflections by the help of his imagination, which he describes by a land where there is no way. The means, therefore, of attaining to the knowledge of God and of ourselves is the obscure night with all its aridities and emptiness, though not in the fullness of the other night of the Spirit, for this knowledge is, as it were, the beginning of the other. Amid the aridities and emptiness of this night of the desires, the soul acquires also spiritual humility, which is the virtue opposed to the first capital sin, spiritual pride. The humility acquired by self-knowledge purifies the soul from all imperfections into which we fell in the day of our prosperity. For now, seeing ourselves so dried up and miserable, it does not enter into our thoughts, even for a moment, to consider ourselves better than others, or that we have outstripped them on the spiritual road as we did before. On the contrary, we acknowledge that others are better than we are. Out of this grows the love of our neighbors, for we now esteem them, and no longer judge as we used to do, when we looked upon ourselves as exceedingly fervent, and upon others as not. Now we see nothing but our own misery, which we keep so constantly before our eyes that we can look upon nothing else. This state is admirably described by David himself in this obscure night, saying, I was dumb, and was humbled, and kept silence from good things, and my sorrow was renewed. All the good of his soul seemed to him so mean that he could not prevail upon himself to speak of it, and he was silent as to the good of others, because of the pain he felt in the knowledge of his own wretchedness. In this state, too, men are submissive and obedient in the spiritual way, for when we see our own wretchedness, they not only listen to instruction, but desire to have it from anyone who will guide them their steps, and tell them what they ought to do. That presumption which sometimes attended them in their prosperity is now gone. And finally, all those imperfections are swept clean away, to which I referred when I was treating of spiritual pride. End of section 13.
Section 14 of The Obscure Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 13. Other Benefits of the Night of Sense. The imperfections of spiritual avarice, under the influence of which the soul coveted all spiritual goods, was never satisfied in the practices of devotion, because of its eagerness for the sweetness it found therein, become now, in this arid and obscure night, sufficiently corrected. For when the spiritual man finds no more sweetness and delight, as he was wont to do, in spiritual things, but rather bitterness and vexation, he has recourse to them with such moderation that he loses now, perhaps through defect, what he lost before through excess. Though, in general, to those who are come to this night, God gives humility and readiness, but without sweetness, in order that they may obey him solely through love. Thus they detach themselves from many things, because they find no more sweetness in them. The soul is purified also from those impurities of spiritual luxury of which I have spoken before, in this aridity and loathing of the senses which it now finds in spiritual things. For those impurities proceed, in general, from the sweetness which flowed occasionally from the spirit into the sense. The imperfections of spiritual gluttony, from which the soul is delivered in the obscure night, have been discussed in a former chapter, though not all, because they cannot be numbered. I shall not enumerate them here, for I wish to conclude the subject of this night, that I may pass on to the other, with regard to which I have serious things to write. Suffice it then to say that the soul, in addition to the benefits already mentioned, gains, in this night, innumerable others in its resistance to spiritual gluttony. It is set free from those imperfections there enumerated, and from many other evils greater than those described, into which too many fall, as we learn by experience, because they have not corrected their desires in the matter of spiritual gluttony. For when God, in this arid and obscure night, so curbs the desire and bridles concupiscence that the soul can scarcely feed it all upon the sensible sweetness of heavenly or earthly things, and this so continuously that the soul corrects, mortifies, and controls its concupiscence and desires, so that the very forces of its passions seem to be broken down, marvelous benefits flow forth from that spiritual temperance, in addition to those I have mentioned. For, through mortifying concupiscence and the desires, the soul dwells in spiritual tranquility and peace, because, where concupiscence and desire have no sway, there is no trouble, but, rather, the peace and consolations of God. Another benefit is this, a perpetual recollection of God, with fear lest we should be going back on the spiritual way. This is a great benefit, and not the least, of aridity in the purgation of the appetite, for the soul is cleansed thereby from those imperfections which disfigured it through the affections and desires, the effect of which is to obscure and deaden the soul. Another great benefit of this night is the practice of many virtues at once, such as patience and long-suffering, which are well tried in these aridities, when men persevere in their spiritual exercises without sweetness or comfort. The love of God is practiced, because men are no longer attracted by sweetness and consolation, but by God only. The virtue of fortitude is also practiced, because amid the hardships, the absence of sweetness, which the soul now endures, it gathers strength from weakness, and so becomes strong. Finally, all the virtues, cardinal, theological, and moral, are practiced amidst these aridities. David tells us from his own experience that the soul gains these 4 benefits in this obscure night, namely, delight of peace, constant recollection of God, pureness of soul, and the practice of all virtues. My soul, saith he, refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was delighted, and was exercised, and my spirit swooned away. He adds also, I meditated in the night with my own heart, and I was exercised, and I swept my spirit clean of all affections. The soul is purified also in this aridity of the desires from the imperfections of envy, anger, and sloth, and acquires the opposite virtues. Softened and humbled by these aridities, by the hardships, temptations, and afflictions which in this night try it, it becomes gentle with God, with itself, and with its neighbors. It is no longer impatiently angry with itself because of its own faults, nor with its neighbors for theirs. Neither does it avoid with a kind of dislike the things of God, nor utter unseemly complaints because he does not perfect his work at once. As to envy, the soul is now charitably disposed towards everyone, and if any remain, it is no longer vicious as before, when the soul was afflicted at the preference shown to others, or at their greater progress. For now it yields to everyone, considering its own misery, and the envy it feels, if it feels any, is a virtuous envy, a desire to emulate them, which is a great virtue. The sloth and weariness now felt in spiritual things are no longer vicious as they were once. They were once the fruit of spiritual delights which the soul experienced at times and sought after when it had them not. But this present weariness proceeds not from the failure of sweetness, for God has taken it all away in this purgation of the appetite. Other innumerable benefits flow from this arid contemplation. For in the midst of these aridities and hardships, God communicates to the soul, when it least expects it, spiritual sweetness, most pure love, and spiritual knowledge of the most exalted kind, of greater worth and profit than any of which it had previous experience, though at first the soul may not think so, for the spiritual influence now communicated is most delicate and imperceptible by sense. Finally, inasmuch as the soul is purified of all affections and sensitive desires, it attains to liberty of spirit, wherein it acquires the 12 fruits of the Holy Ghost. It is also delivered in a most wonderful way from the hands of its 3 enemies, the devil, the world, and the flesh. For when all sensible delight and sweetness are quenched, the devil, the world, and the flesh have no weapons wherewith to assail it. These aridities, then, make the soul love God in all pureness, for now its operations depend no longer upon the pleasure and sweetness which it found in its works, as perhaps was the case when that sweetness was present, but only in the desire it has to please God. The soul is not now presumptuous and self-satisfied, as perhaps it may have been in the day of its prosperity, but timid and diffident of self, deriving no satisfaction whatever from self-contemplation. Herein consists that holy fear by which virtues are preserved and grow. This aridity quenches concupiscence, and subdues our natural spirits. For now, when God infuses from time to time His own sweetness into the soul, it would be strange if it found by any efforts of its own any comfort or sweetness in any spiritual act or practice. The fear of God and anxiety for His service increase in this arid night, for as the beasts of sensuality, which nourished and sustained the desires that clung to them, become dry, nothing remains in that aridity and detachment but an anxious desire to serve Him, which is most pleasing unto God, as it is written, "A sacrifice to God is an afflicted spirit."
When the soul beholds the many and great benefits which have fallen to its lot in this arid purgation through which it passed, it cries out with truth, O happy lot, forth unobserved I went. I escaped from the bondage and thraldom of my sensitive desires and affections unobserved, so that none of my three enemies were able to hinder me. These enemies of the soul so bind and imprison it, that it cannot go forth out of itself to the liberty of the perfect love of God, by the help of its tastes and desires, without which they can do nothing against it. And therefore, when the four passions of the soul, joy and grief, hope and fear, are subdued by persevering mortifications, when the natural sensitive appetite is lulled by continual aridities, when the concert of the senses is silent, and when the interior powers have ceased from discursive reflections, this is the household of man's lower nature, these enemies cannot hinder the spiritual liberty of the soul, and the house thereof remains tranquil and at rest. End of section 14.